So now that we have our snowflake drawn onto our final project paper, the next step that we're going to be doing is creating the watercolor painting in the background. So you get to decide what colors you want to work with. It does not matter to me what colors you choose. I want you to have fun and enjoy your final product. So you also need to decide how much white paper behind your snowflake do you want to see in the end, because you have the option of covering the whole snowflake with color, or you have the option of painting around the snowflake so that it still shows up white in the end, and that's just your personal choice. So before we do that, we're going to experiment with our watercolor paints and different techniques that you could choose for the background of this assignment. So I'm giving each student this practice technique chart that's printed on watercolor paper. What you're going to want to do is turn in your sketchbook to the next empty page, and then we're going to tape this down into our sketchbook. So I want to take that tape and I want to just kind of keep it on the edge of the paper and then just kind of press down on my finger. And I'm going to do this on all four sides. This process is called dry stretching, and it's going to secure this piece of paper to our sketchbook so it's in there long term, but also it's going to help prevent our paper from wrinkling as we work on it. All right, and that is okay if your tape goes into the paper some. That's not a big deal. So there are 6 techniques that you're going to learn to work with, that you're going to choose your favorite techniques to put on your final project. So the first thing I want to do is introduce you to your watercolor palette. So each student is going to get their own palette. There's about 16 colors on the palette. You should have a paintbrush in there, a large cup that's been glued down, and a smaller cup that's been glued down. Your small cup has a lid on it because there's salt on the inside. So when we use watercolor paints, you want to use every bit of paint from the individual paint well until it's gone. So some students think that if there's a hole in the middle of the paint and you can see the bottom of the plastic tray, that you can't use it anymore. That's not true. That's actually a whole lot of paint still left in there. So when you raise your hand and say, Mrs. Kendall, I need more of this color, I'm going to ask you, is there any color left? Because you have to use every bit of color in that particular well before I will give you another one. So when we work, I'm going to be putting water inside this larger cup that's glued down. At the end of class, what's going to happen is I'm going to roll a cart past your rows, and as I pass, you're going to empty this cup. So you need to practice how to do that first. So these paintbrushes are removable, and these individual paints also are meant to come out of the palette so that you can refill them when they run out. So if I need to dump the water from this cup into the dirty water into the bucket, if I just turn my tray over, everything's going to fall out. I don't want that to happen. So I want you to learn how to dump out your water cups. And I'm going to have you practice this. You're going to place your hand over the top of your paintbrush and your paints, and a hand over the small cup, making sure the lid's secure. Then you're going to flip that over. Nothing should fall out, because when I go to dump my water, just the water should fall into the bucket and everything else should stay in your tray. So you're going to practice that before I put the water in your cups. But then I will be filling water in your cups, and it doesn't take a whole lot of water to make the watercolor paints work. So this piece of paper that we taped down is going to teach us 6 different techniques. We're going to go through 2 at a time, and then you're going to practice on your own, and then I will show you the next couple techniques. So the first technique says, this is called a watercolor wash. With your paints today, I want you to envision what colors you want to work with for your final project, and I want you to paint with those colors on your practice spots so you can see what the colors are going to look like when they're turned to paint. So these are called watercolors. You have to have water to activate the paint. So when I start, I'm going to dip my brush in the water, all the bristles should soak that up. Then I'm going to decide what color I want to work with, and I'm going to swish it around to pick up some paint. So I might start with some orange paint. Okay? I should not be digging into the paint. I'm just brushing it across the top. I might brush it one direction and the other direction, and now I've got enough paint in my bristles to get started. So this first technique is called a wash. I'm just painting flat color directly on my paper. In general, when I use a paintbrush, I want to hold the paintbrush down low on the metal piece. And then when I'm brushing, I want to pull backwards away from the end of my bristles. So the bristles are at the end. I don't want to see students pushing the paintbrush. So we never push the brush, because if you push the brush to paint, what's happening is you're smashing these bristles, and that ruins the shape of the paintbrush. So we always pull the brush backwards away from the end, or we can paint side to side, but we never smash the brush down into the paper. We're not rubbing the brush. We're not pushing the brush. We pull the brush. So please make sure you're using the brush correctly. Okay, so now I'm going to brush this section and just kind of get the feel. I tend to do a couple of strokes before I load my brush again. Show you what that looks like. All right, so I'm not using any more water. I only dunk it in water once. Now I'm going to pick up color, and now I'm just going to brush. So this is called making a wash. If you notice, you can still see the words showing through the paint, because watercolor paint is transparent. So I should still be able to read those words through my paint colors, because watercolor should not be going on thick. All right, then anytime I'm done with my color, I'm going to swish it around in the cup. I'm going to dry it off on my paper towel. That's going to soak up any color that might be left in the brush. And then I'm going to try my next one. This one is called a graded wash. So a graded wash means the color is going to fade from light to dark. So when we use watercolors, the amount of water determines how bright your color is going to be. So if I want my color to be brighter, I use less water. If I want it to be lighter, I use more water. So I'm going to dip my brush. I'm going to pick up my color. So I'm just wiping it once on the back side, once on the front side. And then I'm going to start my wash. Okay. If I want it to be a graded wash, I want it to get lighter as I go. I'm not going to pick up any more paint. Instead, I'm just going to get a little bit of water on my brush. I'm just going to touch the tops of the paintbrush in the water. And then I'm going to come back over here. And I'm just painting with the water on my brush. And I'm just going to continue until I get to the end of my space. So you can see how it started out bright and it faded. If I want the brighter end to get brighter, I'm not going to put any more water on my brush. I'm just going to pick up a tiny bit of color, and I can layer that into it. And that's called the graded wash. So I want you to try the first two techniques, and then we'll move on to the next two. The next technique that we're going to do is called a Crayon Resist. So if you decide that you want the white paper to show up still through your snowflake, what we do is we use a crayon to color on the paper first, and then when we paint over it, the paint will not stick where the crayon is. If you look at this one, this snowflake also had some details outlined with blue crayons. So there's some blue lines around this design. There's some blue variations around the edges of these. So you also have that option where you could outline your snowflake with a color if you want that to show through. If you want the paper to stay white, we're going to use a white crayon. So when we do this, you don't want to color your entire section with the crayon, because if you do, no paint is going to show up. But instead, you might draw some designs on the surface. So I'm just going to start by making some stripes. So I've done a couple of stripes with white. I might do some stripes with pink and some stripes with blue. So any colors you think you want to work with on your final project, practice it in this space. Okay, then, all right, once I had my crayons drawn, now I'm going to pick a color to do a wash over the top of. If I have not used that paint color yet, I need to dip my brush in water. I kind of wipe it off on the edge, and then I'm going to pick up whatever that color is I'm going to work with. So I kind of brush front side, back side. And now I'm going to paint a wash over the top. So you can see how the paint is being repelled by the crayon, and the crayon's going to show through. Okay, so we call that a Crayon Resist, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what those stripes look like. If I can get the camera to focus. So the next one says wet on wet. When we do wet on wet, what we want to do is paint the paper with water first. So I'm going to paint water on the paper. This is going to kind of give it a tie-dye effect. Then I'm going to pick up my paint color. So maybe I want to sample some green. And I'm just going to touch the surface and watch what it does on its own. The paint's going to move around on its own. I could do this with multiple colors. So now I switch to yellow. I clean my brush. Maybe I want some red in here, orange in here. Another thing is I could go back over the top with a really wet paintbrush and just kind of drop water on the surface. So the paint, you can't really control where it's going to go. That's the fun part of wet on wet. The paint just has a mind of its own. The water is going to make it blend and kind of smear where it's going to go on its own. All right, the next technique we're going to do is dry brush. So just like it sounds, you want a drier brush to work with. So I'm going to soak up some water off my brush. Then I'm going to pick up the color that I want to work with. And my brush should not be dripping with water. It should be pretty dry. This is when we create kind of scratchy, textured lines. The paint should not be runny. It should be very, very dry. So if my paint is getting too soft, I'm not putting my brush in water. I'm just going to load it with more paint. And then I can add more brush strokes. You could layer colors if you want. So I'm going to pick up my next color. Again, I dried my brush off. My brush is not watery. And you just end up seeing more textured brush strokes when you do dry brush. Okay, the next technique is called the salt technique. So this is where we're going to use this little cup that's glued down with the lid on it. You're going to carefully take the lid off. If the cup pulls off, just let me know and then we can glue it back on. But inside this little cup is salt. Kitchen salt. What's going to happen is that when you paint your space with color, so let's see, I'll work with this blue. So I'm going to do a wash, or I could do this with wet on wet. Then I'm going to pinch a tiny bit of salt between my fingers, and I'm going to sprinkle it over the top of the painting. Maybe do a little more. If your salt cup is running out, just raise your hand, let me know, and I will refill it. What's going to happen is the salt is going to absorb the paint color. and you're going to end up with these speckles on your project. We leave that salt there to dry overnight, and then next class when you come back to me, we brush it off and you'll see little speckles on the surface. So you can kind of see how the little salt pieces are getting darker. That's because the salt is absorbing the paint color around it. The salt technique does not work if your paint is dry, so you have to have fresh, wet paint underneath before you sprinkle the salt. So I want you to determine which technique you like and that you want to work with for your background of your paint project. You are welcome to paint any design you want to in the background. So if you want your background to have stripes, that's perfectly fine. If you want your background to be painted in swirls, that's fine. So this method for me, this was the wet on wet method where I had just lots of the cool colors that mixed together in the background. So whatever you think you want to work with for your final project, the bottom half of this paper says, practice the painting techniques and the colors you want to use in the background of your snowflake project. So really sample the colors and the designs you think you want to work with so that when we do our actual project, you already have this reference. You know exactly what you like and don't like. And practice with crayons or salt if you want to do that. So I might do a combination here of some wash with some wet on wet. If I just add water to it, make it more runny, it's going to start to bleed. While it's still fresh, I'm going to sprinkle my salt. Maybe I see what happens if I draw some swirly lines with crayons. So the whole purpose of this section is to figure out your plan, what you like, what you don't like, so that you are ready to go next class when we work on our background colors.